I have had a wonderful experience interviewing Urs Koenig. He's one of those guests that the conversation flowed. The energy went in the right direction to help the conversation move along. And I hope you as a listener can pick up on that energy. He has such a lot to say. And I think the key is it focuses around his own purpose as a human being. He's a mission-driven, purpose-driven leader who really understands who he is, but also is open to his own blind spots. And I think the key message I would urge anybody listening to these next 2 episodes is actually listen to who you trust to get that feedback from them and look at what you can do differently, because often they might notice something that's in your blind spot. And that's the way we can build ourselves as better leaders. The second thing is looking about vulnerability. And Urs and I talk about the fact that sometimes vulnerability becomes an overused thing. But the reason I keep banging the drum about it is the fact that actually people aren't doing it fully. We talk a good game about psychological safety, but it's not yet happening. So my view is look at what you can do. And how do you build trust in your organization? You build trust by being vulnerable, by opening up and making time for each other. So listen out for what Urs did in how he made that conversation with his people in his team. Because what Urs did himself was special and it helped him clear the way for future things. So I had a wonderful conversation with him. I know you'll enjoy listening to it. If you have questions or comments, please fire them back to me. It's phil@igniumconsult.com. Listen to the podcast, spread the word. And as I said to Urs, at the end of the day, we like to spread the message one podcast at a time, because that's how we get the purpose-driven world to really sit up and listen. Thank you. Enjoy the show. Welcome back to the Sparks by Ignium podcast. I am Phil Rose, your host, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Urs Koenig. Urs is a rare blend of leadership expert, ultra-endurance athlete, academic, and UN peacekeeper. We talked before about his long bio that he gave me, and we decided we would chop it down. But what I'd like to say before we do that is that in 2017, Urs served as a military peacekeeping commander in the UN mission to the Balkans. And in 2021, he served as a UN military peacekeeper in the Middle East. He's got a wide-ranging leadership experience covering a number of different areas. But the key is he's an expert on humble leadership. And that's why we're going to be talking today. He sent me his book, Radical Humility, over the summer. And I've been reading it and listening and learning to what he has to say. And I know you as our audience will love hearing what he has to say, because that mix that I think brings it to life. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Urs Koenig to the Sparks by Ignium podcast. Welcome.
Thank you, Phil, for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Oh, thank you. And it's interesting because I looked at your intro you sent me, and there's so much in it, and we could have gone with so many things. But I would love to pick up on a bit about who Urs is, because I think there's a fascinating story here from those young days as an endurance athlete. And one thing in your book, you've got lots of great photos, and there's one picture of you struggling or pushing up a mountain on your skis. And I say struggling because I ski and I struggle when I go uphill, as most downhill skiers do. But tell me, what is it that makes you who you are today as an endurance athlete and a radical humility expert?
Wow, that's a big question, Phil.
Straight in.
Well, I think at the heart of it, I really am what I write about in the book. I'm tough on results and I'm tender on people. I have a military background. You mentioned that. We can talk more about that. I have the ultra endurance background, started out, as you pointed out, as a cross-country skier, actually. So, very tough on results, like no nonsense. Give me results, give me action. At the same time, I'm a relationship person. I really thrive on connecting with people. And so I think that tough on results, tender on people is truly to the bone who I actually am as a person in my personal life, with my kids, with my family, and in my professional life with my clients.
Yeah, I love that. And it's interesting. I love what you say there about that tough on results, tender on people, because when I looked at the book, this is one of the things that really comes out from here. For any of the listeners watching on YouTube, there's 2 things on this kind of front cover here. Be a badass leader, but also be a good human. And I think that really brings out who Urs is from what I've spoken to him about before. Tell me about this, though, from a point of view of, going into endurance athletics of any kind at a young age is a tough gig. We all know that. And that's at a young age. But you and I are both older than we were a few years ago, but we still do these things. So what is it that keeps you going?
You know, Phil, have you heard that one? The older we get, the faster we were, right? So I'm glad you asked that. I just did an Everesting literally 2 weeks ago. So
Oh,
Everesting, for those who don't know, is climbing the equivalent of the elevation of Mount Everest, 8,848 meters or 29,000 feet, pretty much nonstop. And then because I'm old, you pointed it out so kindly, my knees don't like going downhill, so I take the gondola down or the mountain bike. So 2 weeks ago in my home country, Switzerland, I did a solo unsupported Everesting event where
wow.
I parked 4 mountain bikes on the top of the mountain. During the day, I hike up, take the gondola down. At night, when there's no gondola, I rode the 4 mountain bikes down. And so I did that in 23 hours. But you
Wow.
asked me, why do I still do this? There's, of course, a lot to it. First of all, I do like, and you can relate, I do like to move my body.
Yeah.
It is something I genuinely enjoy. It's frankly also something that keeps me mentally healthy.
Yeah.
It is one way for me to manage my anxiety, my stress. And so being out and about is certainly good for my mental health. But we don't have to do everything to take care of our mental health with working out. So what I love about it, it's the immersion. It's the being in the here and now. Everything else falls away.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm doing this, as I mentioned, for 23 hours. I don't think about my to-do list, my kids who sometimes are difficult, sometimes they're wonderful, like all the things we deal with in life, everything falls away. So being truly immersed in the experience, honestly, that is probably the biggest draw for me. So that's,
Wow.
I just love that.
Wow. It reminds me of the phrase, we don't grow old because we stop running. We stop running because we grow old, or the other way around. And I think that's the key, isn't it? We often have that mental image of what old people can or can't do, but actually it's all about mental toughness. And I think when you said about being tough on results, it sounds like you're giving yourself that tough bit of love to say, look, I've got to keep doing these things because that's what drives me. So in the end of the day, you just keep running, you keep skiing, you keep doing that climbing because that's the thing that keeps you feeling young.
That's very true. And at the same time, you're absolutely right, Phil. At the same time, age is not just a number. I mean, we all grow older. We have issues. I know you have knee issues. I have foot issues. And so we need to be, or I need to be much smarter now. And, you know, we don't have to talk in detail about all the technicalities of it, but recovery, sleep, like all the stuff that when we were young was just a no-brainer. We could just power through it. And now I can't just power through it anymore. I need to be much smarter about it.
Yeah. I found that over the summer I was in Croatia and my daughter asked me to go for a run. I thought we were just going to run to Dubrovnik, but she wanted to run on the circuitous route to get to Dubrovnik. So 10 kilometers later, 25 degrees temperature, we were still running. And my daughter, who's 21, is an extremely athletic, fit girl. And I was struggling to keep up with her. Whereas 5 years ago, it would be the other way around. But I'm glad that I've created a daughter who enjoys running and keeps me going now, which is always a good sign.
Absolutely, I love that.
So let's get into the book. I think that there's a couple of things here actually. Your book, I really appreciate you sending this to me because when I looked through it, there's so many things there. And I said I read it over the holiday period, and I love this thing about radical humility. Where did that come from for you? Because you talk in the book about then and now, about the past way of doing things, about the current way of doing things, where we should be doing things. So how did you come up with that title, Radical Humility, and what does that mean to you?
Well, I think it's a catchy title, so that's where we started. So I have to go back a little bit. Actually, I was always drawn to humble people in my life, and so talked about ultra endurance stuff. So in the ultra cycling world, I was drawn to competitors who let their legs do the talking versus the big mouths. And so I was always in my professional life, in my athletic life, drawn to humble folks. But I didn't really study like humility as a leadership trait. And then I was an executive coach for a long time. When we came out of the financial crisis in the 08, 09, and social media started to explode, a
Mm.
lot of my clients always felt a step behind. And so, and a lot of them were still leading very much centralized, top-down command control leadership.
Yeah.
And so that got me sort of digging into, there must be a different way. And then, Humble Leadership by Shine and Shine was published shortly thereafter,
Yeah.
which, I was, of course, digging big time. And then, but I still didn't really study humility as a leadership trait with any seriousness. And then you mentioned the two missions in 2017 in the Balkans, and then 21 in the Middle East.
Mm.
And ironically, going back into the military, and I'd love to talk more about like that piece as well, because I
Yeah.
went back as a really old guy, but and that was a humbling experience in itself. But ironically, going back into a hierarchical environment like the military actually showed me that the best commanders are truly humble. They have deep self-awareness. They
Mm.
build meaningful relationships with the teammates. And so when I came back from my second mission, I said, okay, now I finally have a book in me. So I experienced firsthand the power of humble leadership
Yeah.
in these UN missions, and coupled with my interest in humility. And so then I really went to town and did the research exactly, and brought those two things together. And of course, the output of that research quest is the book.
Yeah, I love that, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because I love the fact that you've been and done that, and I think a lot of people listening to this will be saying, why would anyone want to go and do peacekeeping missions in the Balkans, in the Middle East? They're dangerous areas. And there's one thing about you that you mentioned last time, and it's your purpose. And I'd love you just to talk about what your purpose is, because I think that says a lot about you, and it connects the dots as to why you would go and do what you did. So to just explain to me about your purpose and the words you use.
So my purpose, and everybody says that. I'm keenly aware of that. We all want to make an impact. We want to make a difference. Like everybody says that, right? And so, and many people really do that. I always have a bit of a hunger to push the envelope a little bit. And so, and if I might just quickly talk how I got into the peacekeeping, and then I can come back to the purpose. So when I was 14, my dad took, this is in the 80s, he took 3 months unpaid leave from his corporate job to volunteer in a refugee camp in Somalia. And that really, I was 14, that inspired me in a big
Wow.
way. And my dad and I were very close. And that actually inspired me to study geography, because I really wanted to get into what was back then called overseas aid work.
Wow.
And then for a variety of reasons, I did study geography. I even wrote a PhD, but I never actually got into that line of work for a variety of reasons, family, other professional endeavors, not the least also my athletics. But then a couple of things happened. I was approaching 50.
Mm.
My dad passed away recently. And as I mentioned, we were very close. And I really had a good hard look at my life. And I went, what are the things I don't want to look back on and go, I wish I would have done that. And doing meaningful international work was one thing I haven't yet done.
Wow.
And I really wanted to still do. And so I'm 50. I want to have so I'm looking at all these different options. How do I get into this line of work? So I want to have some responsibility. I want to get paid. It needs to be meaningful. So I researched a lot of different organizations, NGOs, government organizations, and then I found peacekeeping as part of that research. And I went, I've been an officer many years ago. There is, it's meaningful, not without its problems, of course, and it makes an impact. I have leadership responsibility, so I applied. And so I went back after having been out of the service for 28 years to serve as a peacekeeping commander, as you mentioned, in the Balkans. And so coming back to the question around purpose, really my drive to make a difference, a meaningful difference, beyond the stage, beyond the work with my clients, leadership development, but on the ground, in the field. So that is something that truly drives me. And as a side note, as somebody who's in leadership development, to go back and live in my clients' shoes, matrix organizations, direct reports, peers, people in their 20s who are my direct reports, like that's so valuable for me to live in my client's shoes. So and I dig leadership, unsurprisingly. So I dig researching it, writing about it, and I dig doing it myself. And so So that's how I came about to go back into the military. And I might actually feel I might have one more mission in me. Actually, I have two teenage boys. I promised them I won't do another mission until they're out of high school. My younger one has 2 more years, and I would love to do something on the African continent, actually, which I haven't done. So I might have one more in me.
Wow, that's amazing. And it's amazing, isn't it? You said that, you'd been out of the military for 28 years, and you make a point of this in the book that, as a Swiss national, you did your national service as a young man. So to go back into that at that time with all the knowledge you had, but went back in as a junior. And you tell a great story at the beginning about dropping things. When you talk about, you dropped I think it was you dropped your rifle.
No, I dropped my flak jacket.
Oh, your flak jacket. That's right. You dropped your flak jacket. Yeah. So just tell me that story, because I think that says again a lot about your humility in the face of working with younger people.
Right. So yeah. So this is so I go back. I have a lot of experience, life experience, professional experience, but my military knowledge is outdated. It really is. And I also was keenly aware that I don't really suffer fools very well. So I need to just keep my mouth shut if I have a boss that I don't agree with. And I cannot come across as the old arrogant guy who knows everything better. And so this is on the second or third day is the scene you're referring to, where, it's 7 a.m., it's freezing cold in the heart of Switzerland. And, back then we didn't have flak jackets. So I dropped the flak jacket on the hard asphalt, and I get chewed out by this young sergeant, literally 25 years my junior. This was my first test in humility. I could have made a snarky comment. I could have, whatever, but I just kept my mouth shut and said nothing at all. And so it was it's a great little scene that exemplifies what I really set out to do, which is show up with a lot of humility, because I'm a newbie as far as the military is concerned, and I needed to work my behind off to get my knowledge back up to speed, which of course I did. But
I love that, and I think that leads into nicely in terms of the first path. And I'd love to talk through the model you use, and for those who are on video looking at this, you can see the pictures I'm showing up. And if you're not looking on YouTube, it's always worth just going to see these podcasts on YouTube. We're putting them out there so people can see things. And there's the stages you go through in terms of this transformation from the now leadership from the then leadership. And you talk there about digging deep, and you talk about your blind spots, and the fact that every leader has to be more aware of themselves, because in the past we just ignored our blind spots. And you talk about the Johari window. And I'd love you to talk about, that self-awareness for you, because I think that comes out really clearly for you. You're a very self-aware person. Again, that's just my reading my book and the book and talking to you. But you talk about that in terms of understanding yourself a bit more. How did that come about for you? Because there's some stories behind that as well about understanding who you are.
So I think we're all work in progress, all of us. And, the blind spots are by definition blind, meaning I'm not aware of them. So the blind spots are the things in the Johari window that everybody else knows about me, but I don't, right? And the irony is that we will never actually discover our blind spots unless we proactively take an effort to ask for feedback, to get input and advice. And so, I appreciate your kind words around, I come across as a self-aware person, but certainly, we're all still work in progress. So what I do and what I advise my clients to do is to constantly check in with the people around me in terms of how am I doing? And so I will ask you at the end of this podcast, Phil, how was I as a guest? What can I do better next time? And so I do this with my kids. And do I do it perfectly? Absolutely not. But I work on the regularly checking in. How can I be a better dad? Yeah. What do you see me do well? What can I do better? But I also want to point out that, in the leadership arena, in the professional environment, leadership is not a popularity contest. In other words, we always ask for feedback. We always listen. We always thank for the input. But I get to decide what I'm acting on and what I'm not acting on. So, being very clear that everybody around me has their own agendas as well, right? And their feedback is their feedback, and it's filtered through their agenda. And so being, smart around that is important as well. So it's not just, I roll over and do everything everybody else tells me. Absolutely not. But so it's this, this is why I often talk about leadership being a thinking person sport, right? So I
Love
need
that.
to think what comes in, what are the data points, and then, work on acting on those that I really feel I want to act on.
Yeah. And it's really interesting, actually. I mentioned before this, I was over at Harvard last week for a personal development, looking at how we grow the value of businesses, but also interesting from a point of view of me as well. And we were talking about feedback, and someone said a phrase which I thought was really good, which fits in with this, that if you get feedback from one person, it's just their opinion. But when you get the same feedback from 10 people, it's like looking in a highly polished mirror. And I think that's really interesting, isn't it? Because what you said there is, I can decide what I want to act on. But if it's just you giving me a piece of feedback, hey, that's just Oz's piece of feedback and it's useful, I can decide what to do with it. But when you get the same feedback from a bank of people, then you can say, okay, maybe they're noticing something that I'm not noticing. And I love the fact you've said there is we could decide what to do with it. That's the choice we have as leaders and as human beings.
Yeah, I think that's right on. So there's an interesting point you bring up around, one person versus 10 or 15. So when I give speeches, you get feedback here and there. And often, I have to admit, I ignore it because it's just one person's opinion. But if there's a trend, to your point exactly, if the same thing keeps, like this story really doesn't work, or that transition like didn't sit well, or your energy was off there, then if there's a trend, if there's numerous people mentioning that, certainly then we start to pay attention and actually make a change.
Yeah, I think that's a key point. And I wonder as well, think about your journey there. You talked about, when you got chewed up by a gentleman 25 years you're younger, and you had to hold your tongue and say, okay, I'm here as a newbie, I'm here as a learner.
Right.
That journey took you into that. So when you're thinking about writing this book and putting together these stories around radical humility, I'd love you just to talk through a bit more about the stages you talk about in the book. That you have to go through, because we have to understand our own blind spots. We have to go through that digging deep, as you call it. And we said we'd run this over 2 podcasts, so there's plenty of time to talk deep here about things. But if you looked at the 5 stages you've got there, if you had to pick one and say, this is the key to making radical leadership come about, which one you would say, hey, you must listen to this if you could choose?
So you're asking me to pick one out of the 5?
Yeah. Is it possible?
It's a toughie, I have to be honest with you. I do think, so the way I structure it, it's the digging deep. This is like, I dig deep. So that's my work, right? And then the way I structure it, I talk about 3 other shifts that are one-on-one leadership. And then the last shift is organizational leadership, a fearless culture. And so if we have to start somewhere, we start with ourselves, because, and that's the digging deep. So that's the first shift that I talk about, which is about the self-awareness we just talked about. It's about this notion of focus.
Yeah.
Having the humility, and we're all business owners and leaders, we're all guilty of this. We think we can do everything, right? And we constantly spread ourselves too thinly. But having the humility to know and understand that I can't do everything, but I can do almost anything I put my mind to. And this, Michael Porter in Corporate Strategy talks about this, where the strategy is first and foremost deciding what not to do.
Yeah.
And that is true. And, and talking about sports earlier, I mean, I mentioned my sister, who's, by the way, was the much more successful athlete in orienteering, numerous world champion. I'm very proud of my sister, can you tell? So she is a shining example of ruthless focus. She's a mother of 4. She's a teacher. She's a coach. When she races, when she trains, everything else falls away. So, Searle was his name, Olympic rower, said, I've never made any sacrifices. I made choices. And so athletes are a wonderful example of how to focus, of how to say no and remove distractions. And so now I don't know where we started, but I think that if we had to start somewhere, we start with this digging deep. And then the last piece within the digging deep shift, I talk about this, how to fail successfully.
Yeah. Okay.
So,
that's interesting.
how do I shift from seeing mistakes and failures, as something to be embarrassed about? And let's be real, like all of us, we're high achievers. When we fail, and especially when we fail publicly, we often get flooded with like these emotions, shame, embarrassment, guilt, all that stuff. And so how do I talk about the skill of reframing? How do I shift from being flooded by these strong emotions, getting out of my heart into my head by reframing and learning from my experience? And again, coming back to the athletic background, sport is a wonderful, and this is almost too obvious to state, it's a bit of a cliche, but it's a wonderful playground to learn how to fail, because you'll fail regularly as an athlete. So anyway, that's where I would start, Phil.
Yeah, I love that. And it's interesting actually, because here you failed big time, and you failed big time when you were right across America. And you failed not because of lack of willingness, but because of health condition at that time that any athlete could manage. And you talk in the book about the work of Carol Dweck. And I think over the last 15 to 20 years, I've often talked about growth mindset. But I think one of the things that links that in for me is when you did fail and you set yourself out, you set yourself with that goal to do things. Can you talk me through what was it like to come out of that and realize that you weren't going to achieve the goal you'd set out to do at that time? Because I think that's a big thing about you as well, that you got up and you got back in the saddle, so to speak.
Yeah, and it was incredibly difficult. Like I mourned this loss, so I almost actually died during the race across America. It's a non-stop transcontinental bike race, 3,000 miles. And I was suffering from pulmonary edema, and I was in ICU for quite some time. And so I failed miserably. And it was incredibly hard for me emotionally, because I invested 2 years of my life. It was a very public failure, at least in my, in my world. And so what helped me was to, first of all, acknowledge the strong emotions, not do the thing, it's just a bike race, like let's move on, like actually work through, and with some introspection. I talked to my family, my crew members, a counselor as well, really process the strong emotions and give them the time and space they require. So the emotional work, the working through my strong feelings of loss, and at the same time going back with a ruthless eye and examining what went wrong. So I underwent many sophisticated tests with high altitude medical researchers, and even there was an academic paper actually published on my case based on the learnings from that. So the emotional work, and at the same time, doing in the Army, we call it after action review.
Okay.
What did I mess up? What went wrong? And so doing that, and it wasn't pretty. It really was for me, a very tough time. Like we don't need to sugarcoat that. It was incredibly hard, but over time and staying in the process, it allowed me to come up with my own reframe statement, which, said basically, the learnings from my near death, from my DNF, from my did not finish, will make me faster the next year. And indeed, the following year, I actually had my best ultra cycling season to date, with numerous course wins and records. And importantly, I wouldn't have been able to achieve that if I wouldn't have failed the previous year. I wouldn't have been able to achieve the successes I had if I wouldn't have failed and then was able to implement those learnings.
Wow. That's really powerful, isn't it? Because I think, there's lots of people who don't go through that processing. I think, you use that military phrase, after action review. And in your book, you talk about the ABCD that you talk about. And the key bit there, when I hear about it, is dispelling those unrealistic beliefs, those beliefs about yourself. And I noticed as you said that to me, I just sensed a sense of loss still in you there at that stage. But you've been through it. But I really can feel that energy from you to say, okay, I had to go do this. But it was a big loss. You put 2 years of your life, and not just that, you told lots of people you're going to do it. You had the support team around you. So I love your ABCD process, because I think it works very well to go through. And I wonder whether you could just talk about, if you think about that ABCD, which are the bits you found hardest to do?
So let's just quickly define the ABCs. So the A is adversity or failure. The B is the beliefs I have about my failure. So I believed I let everybody else down. That was my belief, basically, in a nutshell. And then the C is the consequences, the emotional consequences. I felt shame, embarrassment, guilt mainly for having dragged my crew, who gave up 3 weeks of their summer with me. And then D is the dispelling the unrealistic beliefs and emotions. And so that's where the deep work comes in. And so what helped me verbalizing these strong emotions, these beliefs, to over time see the bike race for what it was. A bike race I did not finish, not more, not less. I'm a worthy athlete. I'm a worthy person. Like DNF did not finish or not. And so that's easy to say, Phil. Now it's super. I'm sitting comfortably in my chair. So easy to say, and actually truly buying into that and myself believing it, that took 6 months, 8 months, maybe. Wow. That took a long, long time. And so the ABCD model that's actually taught to in the US Army to soldiers training in resiliency is a super helpful, very simple framework that can help us to work through that loss. And what I like about it is that it spells out explicitly that we all have these unrealistic beliefs. We all have these emotions. And for many of us, let's be real, just actually verbalizing these emotions is a big step. You know, we often go, oh, come on, it's not that bad. Let's just move on. Like sort of the macho thing in us sometimes. So I like the model for that reason.
No, I love that. And there's something else that came out when you said that, when you said that thing about being a worthy person, because another big bit you talk about in the book is about vulnerability. And I think for anybody putting themselves in the way of danger in terms of what you did is, you know, you were a peacekeeper, but you were in a hostile environment. So there's an element of vulnerability has to come out there. So I wonder, how does vulnerability show up for you? Because it's been an overused word in lots of areas, but I think it's essential. I think you talk about this in terms of if we're going into this VUCA world, which we're well into at the moment, vulnerability in leadership is key. I wonder if you could just talk about that a bit, because I think that links into some of your thing about dispelling these beliefs.
Right. Yes. So I do strongly believe that even though it's overused, I totally agree with you, and I'm probably adding to the overuse here, but vulnerability truly can be a leadership superpower if it's done right. So the first thing I would say is I think of vulnerability in 3 acts. The first act is me. The second act is something I'm sharing about myself, maybe an insecurity, maybe a weakness, something I'm working on, a personal goal. And then the third act is, what am I going to do about it? So in 3 acts. And so let's not just do vulnerability in 2 acts and stop at my insecurities. So that's the first thing I would say. There is fascinating research out there showing that vulnerability is actually the quickest way to build trust. And it's not the other way around. Trust does not come before vulnerability, but vulnerability is the quickest way to build trust. You know, Brené Brown, we're all familiar with her work, of course. She talks about vulnerability is the last thing I want to show you, and it's the first thing I'm looking for in you. So you showing up with a bit of vulnerability, Phil, here makes me feel safe. Oh, he gets me. I can also share something. And then, you know, there's lots of research done on what's called the vulnerability loop. You share something, I mirror, and trust deepens and our relationship grows. And so I think I quote the study, I know I quote the study in the book, where pairs of complete strangers are brought into a lab and they're tasked with asking each other meaningful questions. You know, like, what does love and friendship mean to you? If you only had 1 year to live, Phil, how would you spend it? When after 45 minutes of doing this, they're asked to rate the level of trust they develop with their partner of 45 minutes. They rated the level of trust about as high as the average level of trust they have with people in their lives. Some even rated it as high as the level of trust they have with their significant other. And one pair, I love that, one pair got married. So the point is, even brief periods of sharing with a bit of vulnerability is one of the quickest ways to build trust. So, you know, we all admire perfection from a distance. Nobody can relate to it. So it's sharing a bit about my shortcomings. As you can tell, I'm passionate about this. Sharing a little bit about my shortcomings makes me relatable. But let's be clear. I don't have to, you know, tell you my darkest secrets. It's a thinking person sport. I need to read the room. I need to read my partner. I need to read you right now, Phil. What can I display? How much vulnerability is appropriate and what's not appropriate? And so anyway, I'll stop here.
But I think that's key, actually. And as you're reading that, I'm just I'm just looking at the page in the book, which I'd bookmarked around, the do's and don'ts of vulnerable leadership. And I think there's something you said there about, be comfortable not knowing and learning is one of the key things. But you also think about relentlessly learn and grow. And I think that's one of the key things that sums up this vulnerability, because for you going into this peacekeeping missions, you had to learn. You were 25 years away or 28 years away from last doing it. Things have moved on in 28 years, but you went in there with that open mindset. And I love that, because the only way you were going to learn to grow was to work with your team, to understand and ask questions. And I think that's a really key thing as well. Just, that vulnerability and having that openness to go out and talk to people and say, what do you think?
Yeah. No, I mean, that is one thing I'm good at. I made a real effort to be very transparent with my team, my direct reports, saying, like, look, my knowledge is outdated. I need your help here and there. At the same time, as I mentioned, that's really, really important. Like, vulnerability and humility is no replacement for competency. So I need to work my sweep behind off to get up to speed and learn everything, but be transparent with my team about where my shortcomings are and lean on them while at the same time working very hard to get up to speed. And then, being able to provide other meaningful I talk about, I led by relationship initially versus by competence, because I had to, right? And incidentally, of course, leading relationally is a core element of humble leadership. So, and my team, that's the other thing. If I own my shortcomings, my deficiencies with my team members, they already know that. They work with me they know I'm not perfect. Like, and my teenage boys know that I'm not the perfect dad. Why? I'm here every day. So me simply owning my shortcomings does make me relatable. So
I love that. And I wonder, in that case, what are the big blockers you've seen in your career and inside military and in organization? What are the big blockers you've seen to vulnerability? Because this is a big change between that then and now leadership.
Yes. So I think the biggest one really is deep insecurity. So if I'm really insecure, then I hesitate to share with vulnerability, and then I often cover up with sort of arrogance. And so that is the not healthy blocker. I want to be very clear though, there it's not a one size fit all. There are certainly times, for example, when I'm in a new job and there's questions about my competence to be able to do it, where I want to be thoughtful with how much vulnerability I show up initially. I might actually have to earn my vulnerability with strong deliverables first. So that's, and then another piece, which quite honestly I was made aware only recently, there is, which is a bit embarrassing, but I'm sharing it here with vulnerability. If you're a part of a marginalized group, so I talked to a female African-American executive about this, and she said, that's all very nice and dandy for you as an old white guy to talk about vulnerability. If I would have shown up as a African-American female executive in the 80s with vulnerability, I would have been gone tomorrow. And so that actually, and so that is, that's a reality that, I haven't lived and I don't live. And I see though, and actually, if I may, as an excellent, this person is a podcast host, actually, Phil recommended a wonderful resource by Brené Brown and Burke, You Are the Best Thing. So this is about vulnerability and the Black experience in primarily the States. And so I'm actually reading this right now. And so,
that's worth reading. Okay, I love that. And it's interesting you say that, actually. So over the summer, I watched the first part of the documentary with Simone Biles. And for those who don't know the story, as a gymnast, she was she's the leading light of gymnastics in the world, effectively, not just the US. But effectively, she decided she had enough, and she pulled out the Olympics. And she suffered a lot of hate online because of it. And in the documentary, they talk about what it was like back in the 80s for gymnasts at the time, under various gymnastic experts. And they're white or black, whatever color it was, you couldn't show vulnerability. You couldn't show what it was. And I think the thing I picked up from the Simone Biles interview, and I look at her and admire her, she stood up to this and said, I can't go on. And I think the world has moved on in some circles, but I do wonder whether there are still these undercurrents that we think it's moved on because we stand here as 50-plus-year-old white guys. Maybe there's those marginalized groups that can't be vulnerable even today. And I wonder about that.
Yeah, I wonder about that too. And I think the answer is probably yes. There is,
Yeah.
I mean, there's certainly that's happening. And at the same time, to your point, if we look at the Olympics, like Michael Phelps, one of the most decorated swimmer, talks openly about his battle with depression. And I love that. I'm actually posting a video that Amy Edmondson put together. I'm actually reposting, I think today or tomorrow, on LinkedIn. He talks about, I've been, and everybody would agree, amazingly successful. But that doesn't mean I'm perfect. That doesn't mean I have no self-doubt. That doesn't mean I don't suffer from the gremlins many of us have. Am I good enough? Am I smart enough? All that. So I think we're moving in the right direction overall as a society, as a business community, and yet there is still no question there is certainly marginalized groups where it's very difficult to show up with vulnerability.
Yeah, I think you're right, actually. And I think that's something we all need to call people in on and, have those conversations, because I think, we often stand here and have these conversations, but you're right, there's a big conversation we all need to be having through whatever medium we can to help all people be able to be expressing their opinions on things. And it's interesting you mentioned about the athletics, because I think, we're just on the back of the Olympics in Paris, and the Paralympic Games are still going on, and I see some amazing endeavors from people. But the point you made there is, you may be at the top of your game, but it doesn't mean you don't feel vulnerability. It doesn't mean you feel sometimes I'm on the edge and I need support. And I think when I think about your talk here about digging deep, I think there's a key point here about moving on to the next stage about tough on results, tender on people. As leaders, we have to develop that appropriateness to be, okay, look, these are the results I'm expecting, but let's look at the human being there. And again, I come back to your book here. It's about being a good human. And I think from that vulnerability perspective, we all have a role to play in enabling and encouraging people to speak up without a fear of retribution, without a fear of the toxic culture that exists in business in the 80s and beyond, and latterly as well. So there's a big thing there. So as we come to the end of this first episode on the podcast, first edition of the podcast here, I'd love just to pick up one here, which is about feedback that builds us up. Because I think when we put stuff out there, we say how vulnerable we are. Actually, the key is here is how do we get feedback from individuals and how do we do something with it? And it touches back on what we talked about earlier, that we can make choices about doing something with it. But in terms of that shift, I wonder, what's the best bit of feedback you've been given in the last few years, and how have you dealt with that feedback?
The best piece of feedback I've given over the last few years and how I've dealt with it. I have been given the feedback that when I came back from my peacekeeping mission, on my second one, I went all in on keynote speaking. So I was a coach for a long time, but then transitioned into speaking. And as I tend to do, went all in 150%, and I was starting to burn out. So I got the feedback from my older son, actually, and a dear friend who I often talk about very personal things, that they're observing not so healthy habits. So I don't take days off anymore. I work all weekend, and they hardly see me smile anymore. I'm just like too focused on building the business. And so that was probably the most impactful and helpful feedback, on a personal, really meaniful level that I've gotten over the last few years. And you know what? I'm still working on that. So do I just fix everything because I got the feedback? No, I'm work in progress like everybody else. So now I'm much better about boundaries, except today when I'm accepting a Zoom call at 7 a.m. with Phil. but I just took 2 months. I was in Europe. I did work, but I spent a lot of time. We talked about the Everesting, also with my family. That was like the prime reason why I went. So anyway, so that's something that I've got given as a feedback, and that's been really helpful and meaningful to me, and I'm still working on it.
Well, and thank you for sharing that, because I think that's a big thing, isn't it? That, we get that feedback, and often it's hard to change overnight. It's a belief we have, maybe, that it's hard to change overnight, but we have to, wean ourselves off that to look at what needs to be done and what's the alternatives.
Well, it's exactly right. I think this is, it's sort of, it goes very deep, some of these things, and I bet a lot of your listeners can and viewers can relate to this. Our identity is often, and I speak about myself primarily, is often so wrapped up in what we do professionally as an athlete. I was the race, the race I did not finish. I was the race. So when the race went, I went with it. And so that is it's a strength that is overdone. So a strength is I focus, I go all in, I work hard, and then I overdo it. I become the position, I become the race, and that's when it's not healthy anymore.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? And I wonder, in coaching, we often use, well, I often use the term stop, start, and continue. So if you're looking at what you've just said there, I wonder, what is it you need to stop doing, start doing, or continue doing to make a change for you, to help you step forward into a different way?
I need to stop saying yes to everything, or I need to
I
need to continue having boundaries, and I need to continue asking for feedback. That's another important piece, actually. One-off feedback is great, but then actually checking in. I talk about the sort of stakeholder-centered coaching that I've done for a long time. Regularly checking in with my stakeholders, in my case now, my family and my colleague, but in a professional environment with my team members, how am I doing? And not just one-off, but every month. I'm working on XYZ. How do you see me developing?
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Look, that's a great place to end on this first episode, because I love that as a thing. It's about having that introspection and work out what I need to be doing. And the point I'm learning from you there is, you're asking for that feedback, and you're getting that feedback and internalizing it and doing something with it. So there's some choices that you then make as a result of that. So Urs Koenig, that's been an amazing conversation. We've only spent 50 minutes on this so far. There's a whole other conversation to go. So I'm looking forward to the next episode. Well, we'll pick up on this, and I would love to delve into the next stages of the process you've talked about here, and to look at some of the things you've talked about, and about setting boundaries for people, and then obviously looking at how purpose-driven you are and what that drives you into. So for listeners, please look out for the next episode. But Urs Koenig, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
I loved it, Phil. Thank you so much.
Thank you.